Thomas-Alexandre Dumas was born on the 25th of March 1762 in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. His father, Alexandre Antoine David de la Pailleterie, was the heir to a noble French title, but at the time of Thomas's birth, he was living in hiding after a bitter dispute with his younger brother. Once a soldier, he had retreated to his brother's sugar plantation in the Caribbean, where he remained for decades under an assumed identity. It was there that he purchased an enslaved woman, Musketeer Dumas. She would become the mother of his children, including Thomas, their third. Saint-Domingue itself was a volatile frontier. Unlike mainland France, it allowed a degree of social mobility for free black and mixed-race individuals. Some could own land, build wealth, even wield influence. But that fragile freedom existed alongside a brutal system of enslavement that could, at any moment, strip everything away. In 1775, everything changed. His father's brother, the man who had inherited the family title of Marquis, died suddenly. The path back to France and to power was open, but reclaiming that life required money. And so, in a decision that still echoes with moral weight, his father sold Marie-Cécile and their daughters. When even more funds were needed, Thomas, his own son, was also sold to a French sailor with the promise that he would buy him back once his inheritance was secured. Against all odds, he kept that promise. After reclaiming his title and wealth in France, his father returned and repurchased Thomas, bringing him across the Atlantic. In France, Thomas was given an elite education. He was trained in etiquette, immersed in high society, and introduced to the art of swordsmanship under masters like Chevalier de Saint Georges, widely considered the finest swordsman in Europe at the time. He carried himself like nobility, lived among the elite, and for a moment it seemed as though his past had been erased. But France had its own boundaries, despite his new status and father's recognition. Although slavery had been illegal in metropolitan France since 1315, he was still a black man in a society that imposed limits on what that meant. Sometime around 1785, his father remarried, and relations between father and son began to deteriorate. He refused to attend the wedding, then enlisted as a private soldier in the Queen's Dragoons, an elite cavalry regiment of the French army. His father was outraged. For a nobleman's son to enlist as a common soldier was considered beneath the family name. He forbid Thomas from using the aristocratic surname David de la Pailleterie. Therefore Thomas took the surname of his mother Dumas. Shortly after his enlistment, his father died in 1786, bringing a definitive end to that complicated relationship. Now fully on his own, Dumas threw himself into military life. Standing over 6 feet tall, remarkably imposing for the 18th century, he combined extraordinary strength with athletic grace. He was an exceptional horseman, a gifted swordsman, and possessed the kind of fearless confidence that naturally drew others to him. It's important to note that when Dumas joined the army, he was stepping into a France that was already under immense strain. On the surface, the Kingdom of Louis still projected the grandeur of the old monarchy. The royal court at Versailles remained a symbol of wealth and privilege. However, years of costly wars, including support for the American Revolution, had left the government deeply in debt. Efforts to reform the tax system repeatedly failed, largely because the wealthiest members of society, the clergy and the nobility, were determined to protect their exemptions. France's rigid social order divided the population into 3 estates: the first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility, enjoyed enormous privileges. The Third Estate, which included merchants, artisans, peasants, and the growing urban middle class, shouldered most of the taxes and had the least political power. Poor harvests drove up the price of bread, causing hunger to spread. Enlightenment thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau were gaining traction. They challenged the notion that kings ruled by divine right and argued that liberty and equality were natural rights. These ideas were particularly powerful for a man like Dumas. He had lived both sides of society's contradictions. He had known slavery and privilege, exclusion and acceptance. On the 14th of July 1789, the tension that had been building across France finally erupted. In Paris, an angry crowd stormed the Bastille, the medieval fortress that had become a symbol of royal authority. At first, Dumas remained with his regiment in the countryside, awaiting orders as uncertainty spread throughout the kingdom. Then, on the 15th of August, members of the newly formed National Guard requested the assistance of Dumas and his fellow dragoons to help protect the former estates of Duke of Orléans. It was a small assignment, but it reflected a much larger shift. Opportunities opened for talented soldiers who might otherwise have remained invisible. Promotions came with astonishing speed. In just a few years, he moved from private soldier to lieutenant colonel, then brigadier general, and eventually general of division. By the age of 31, Dumas had become the first man of African descent to attain the rank of general in a European army. By 1796, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas had already earned a reputation as one of the most formidable officers in the French army. But that year, his path crossed with a young general whose name would soon dominate Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. At just 26 years old, Napoleon was given command of the army. It was a bold appointment. The army he inherited was underfed, poorly equipped, and low on morale. But Napoleon brought with him an energy and ambition that electrified his men, and among the officers tasked with turning those ambitions into reality was General Dumas. The two men seemed well matched. After the Italian campaign, where Dumas impressively led cavalry actions, Napoleon recognized Dumas as a commander of rare courage and ability. Austrian troops reportedly referred to him as the Black Devil, a nickname that reflected both his commanding presence and the devastating speed with which he struck. But beneath the victories, tensions were growing. Napoleon relied heavily on his chief of staff, Louis-Alexandre Berthier. Berthier often criticized Dumas in strategy meetings, questioning his decisions and perhaps his independent streak. Even when Dumas played a key role in successful operations, Napoleon sometimes omitted his contributions from official reports sent back to Paris. For a man who had earned every promotion through courage and competence, the slight seemed harsh. The deeper issue, however, was one of principle. Napoleon viewed war as a means to advance both France and his own ambitions. His armies were expected to live off occupied territories, collecting taxes, requisitioning supplies, and stripping locals. Dumas took a different view. He insisted that civilians be treated fairly and ordered his troops to leave enough food for local people to survive. To Dumas, military success meant little if it came at the cost of the very principles of liberty. Despite the friction, Dumas continued to distinguish himself. In early 1797, he joined a division commanded by General Barthélemy Catherine Joubert. Under Joubert, Dumas led daring operations along the Adige River. His most famous exploit came on the 23rd of March at a bridge over the Isaac River in the Tyrol near modern-day Gleissen. There, with extraordinary determination, he held off Austrian forces and drove them back in a feat of personal bravery that stunned both friend and foe. French soldiers began calling him the Horatius Cockles of the Tyrol, comparing him to the legendary Roman hero who defended a bridge against overwhelming odds. Even Napoleon was impressed, but the underlying tensions never truly disappeared. It's worth pausing to note that amid the chaos of revolution and war, he also built a life away from the battlefield. Back in 1789, while stationed near the town of Villers-Cotterets, Dumas came into contact with the family of Claude Labouré, a respected local innkeeper and officer in the National Guard. There, he met Labourè's daughter, Marie. Their love deepened over the years, and on the 28th of November, 1792, they were married. Years later, after countless campaigns and hardships, the couple welcomed a son, Alexandre Dumas, the future novelist who would immortalize his father's spirit in some of the greatest stories ever written. But before that child was born, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas would endure the most harrowing chapter of his life. In 1798, Napoleon launched one of the most audacious expeditions in military history. His goal was Egypt. The campaign was designed to strike at British interests and open a route toward the east. The force he assembled, known as the Army of the Orient, included some of France's most talented commanders, among them Dumas. The campaign seemed successful initially. The French defeated the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids, securing control of Cairo and delivering another dramatic victory for Napoleon. But beneath the triumph, cracks were widening. Dumas met with fellow generals including Chinlan, Louis Desaix, and Joachim Murat. Over shared food and candid conversation, they openly criticized Napoleon's leadership and discussed whether they should refuse to march farther into Egypt. Word of the meeting soon reached Napoleon. He confronted Dumas directly, furious at the challenge to his authority. Though Dumas was not arrested, the trust between the two men was shattered. Determined to leave Egypt, Dumas secured passage back to France in early 1799. In preparing to leave, he loaded the ship with valuable cargo, including coffee and horses, hoping to recover some of the wealth he had never received from his years of service. But fate intervened. As it crossed the Mediterranean, it began taking on water. To keep it afloat, much of the cargo had to be thrown overboard. Then storms drove the damaged ship into the port of Taranto in southern Italy. Dumas expected a friendly reception. He believed the area was under the control of the pro-French Parthenopean Republic, but circumstances had changed. The Republic had collapsed, and Taranto was now controlled by forces loyal to Ferdinand of Naples and supported by the Holy Faith Army led by Cardinal Fabrizio Ruffo. Dumas was arrested. For nearly 2 years, he endured conditions that slowly broke the body of one of France's greatest soldiers. Poorly fed and denied proper medical care. Malnutrition and disease ravaged his health. He developed severe stomach problems, partial paralysis, and persistent weakness. Back in France, his wife Marie refused to remain silent. She wrote letter after letter to government officials and the now rising regime of Napoleon, pleading for intervention. When Dumas was finally released in 1801, he was only 39 years old, but the ordeal had aged him dramatically. The powerful physique that had once inspired awe was weakened beyond repair, and he would never fully recover. Those experiences became part of the family's story, passed down to the young son, who would grow up listening to tales of injustice and endurance. Years later, that son, Alexandre Dumas, would channel those themes into one of the greatest adventure novels ever written, The Count of Monte-Cristo, the story of Edmond Dantès, a man imprisoned, forgotten, and ultimately driven by a desire for justice, owes much to the very real suffering of Thomas-Alexandre Dumas. On the 26th of February, 1806, at just 43 years old, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas died in Villers-Cotterets. He left behind a widow, Marie-Louise Elizabeth Laboureur, and a young son who's not yet 4 years old. For the young Alexandre, his father was more than a memory, he was a legend, and that legend would live on in literature. When Alexandre Dumas began writing, he transformed the themes of his father's life into some of the most beloved adventure novels ever published. In The Three Musketeers, readers meet bold and charismatic heroes who value courage, friendship, and honor above all else. The swagger and fearlessness of the three companions echo his father. In The Count of Monte-Cristo, the connection is even more striking. Edmond Dantès is unjustly imprisoned, abandoned by powerful men, and returns determined to seek justice. It is impossible not to see the shadow of Thomas-Alexandre Dumas in that story, a decorated hero betrayed by politics and left to suffer in captivity. When you step back and look at the full arc of Thomas-Alexandre Dumas's life, it almost reads like one of his son's greatest novels. And yet, despite everything he accomplished, he died young, weakened, and largely forgotten, but still a hero.
Telling all the stories that you never know.
Legacy file, let it resonate. History encoded, elevate the stake. Black soul, never underestimate. Grinding hard, got the vision crystal clear. Channeling the past, so we persevere. Voice of our kings, bring the truth to light. Every you is stepping ready for the fight.